Welcome back, guys. This is your lesson for March 25th, Wednesday. We're going to really focus on some more specifics inside the United States legislative branch today, particularly talking about the cup and saucer analogy, and then finishing up with a conversation about filibusters and filibustering. So let's dive in. Just as a refresher, we have a bicameral legislature, bi meaning two, cameral meaning house. So we have a two-house legislature. And the reason we have a bicameral system is that the framers of the Constitution thought that bicameralism would help both houses of Congress, both the House of Representatives and the Senate, to check the power of the other, right? If we have a unicameral legislature, who's going to balance them out? Who kind of control or check the power that they have? Really nobody. So we create a bicameral system for that reason. Here's a little bit of a refresher on some of the basics about our two houses of Congress, but I really want to focus on two key pieces. The first, as you see highlighted here, is the difference in the length of term for members of the House and members of the Senate. Members of the House serve a 2-year term, members of the Senate serving a 6-year term. That's going to be a critical piece of this conversation about a cup and saucer here in a minute. And then if you see down here at the bottom right in the Senate column, it talks about the idea of unlimited debate in the Senate. And that's going to be a big part of our conversation about filibustering. So when it comes to term lengths, you can kind of see what that looks like as far as broken down by your representatives, your elected representatives. Jim Jordan, your representative in the House, is currently in the middle of his 7th term. If he were to win re-election this November, he would start his 8th term when the 117th Congress is sworn in January 2021. So he's on a 2-year cycle. Rob Portman and Sherrod Brown are on 6-year cycles. And really the reason that becomes significant is because Jim Jordan, as a member of the House of Representatives, is constantly having to think about re-election, right? From the moment he was sworn in for his 7th term in 2019, he knew that he was less than 2 years away from re-election day. So that means that he has to be conscious of that, he has to be aware of that, and he has to be almost actively campaigning from the minute he's sworn in if he wants to be re-elected for another term. Senator Portman and Senator Brown do not really face those same kinds of pressures because of the 6-year term. And it leads us into a conversation from way back in the day, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and it's where we get this cup and saucer analogy. Now, just some basics for those of you that are not big tea drinkers or coffee drinkers. The cup, obviously, I think we all know what the cup is. That's the little stemmed glass you see here. But the saucer, that's the name for the little dish, the little plate underneath it, right? So that's going to be a critical thing here in just a second. But in their conversation, he's really doubtful about how useful the Senate is going to be. His concern is that because senators have 6-year terms, because they're allowed unlimited and endless debate in the Senate, that they're going to move extremely slowly, that they're not going to be able to get things done, that they're not going to be able to move quickly from problem to problem and address some of the nation's issues. Washington listens to Jefferson's doubts. He listens to his concerns, and he basically uses an analogy to explain why he believes that the House of Representatives and the Senate are useful in the way that they're constructed, that it is a good thing that members of the House have 2-year terms and members of the Senate have 6-year terms. And basically what he tells Jefferson is that you pour coffee or you pour tea into a saucer because it cools faster there than it does in a cup. And what does he mean by that? Well, he means pretty simply that when it comes to legislation, when it comes to debate, when it comes to potentially passing laws or establishing new policies, the Senate is a place where things can kind of cool down a little bit. We can move slowly. We don't need to rush into making rash decisions. He tells Jefferson that much the same way that Jefferson poured his tea into the saucer to help it cool, the Senate serves as the saucer in the legislative branch. It's the place where rational thought, where long debate, where a lot of smart, independent thinking can take place before we rush to decisions. So in that analogy, went one too far there. The House of Representatives is the hot cup of tea. They're the cup. That's where the action is. And the action is there because, like I mentioned earlier, those people are always thinking about re-election. Right? From the minute Jim Jordan was sworn in, he has to be concerned with the fact that he's got to run for re-election at that point, really even less than 2 years down the road. So because members of the House are always so focused on reelection, they seem to be significantly more connected to the public. They have to be concerned with what the public is interested in, what the public wants, and how the public perceives the job that they're doing. A lot of times that can force action in the House that maybe isn't always the most thought out. Conversely, in the analogy, the Senate is represented by the saucer. Because senators serve 6-year terms, they're less connected to the public. They don't need to be constantly thinking about reelection. They have the ability, they have the freedom and kind of the leeway to stage really long debates, to put bills on the table and look at them from all sides, to look at all the angles, to look at all the pieces, and really think things through. Because yeah, you'd like to get things done quickly, but in the Senate, the concern is making sure that you get them right, or that's supposed to be the concern in the Senate. Whether they do that or not, I guess, is another question. If you need more examples of really how this cup and saucer analogy relates to Congress, I think this graphic does a really nice job explaining that. One of the pieces that makes the Congress, or makes the Senate, very much the saucer in that analogy is their ability for unlimited debate. And that ability for unlimited debate is really what we're talking about when we talk about the concept of a filibuster. A filibuster, again, only exists in the Senate. It does not exist in the House of Representatives, but it's a strategy in the Senate where somebody that opposes a bill, somebody that opposes a piece of legislation, is basically able to use their right to unlimited debate. They can start debating a particular piece of a bill, they can start debating an entire bill, but they can do it for an unlimited period of time in order to prevent a vote from ever taking place. The point of a filibuster, which we'll get into here in a minute, is not necessarily just to be an obstinate jerk, but sometimes that is kind of the way that it comes across. The idea of filibustering is not something you will find anywhere in the Constitution. While Article 1 of the Constitution is the part that deals primarily with the legislative branch, that is not where you will find the idea of a filibuster. The idea of a filibuster it's actually in the Senate rule book. So the Senate has a rule book which kind of dictates, okay, what are the processes, what are the procedures, what are the rules for debate on the Senate floor in the chamber. And that's where you'll find the idea of a filibuster. The filibuster is created. It's created as a way for senators to kind of make sure that none of their colleagues are sneaking a bill through quickly. That we are given plenty of time to look at all of the different pieces of a bill, to look at all of the different parts, to look at all of the different changes that might come from a bill before voting on it. So that's why filibustering is invented or created in the first place. Originally, under the original context of how a filibuster works, it really only required one person for a filibuster to take place, where one person could dislike a bill. 99 members of the Senate could want to vote yes on a bill, but if one person wanted to filibuster, nobody got to vote. Eventually, that gets changed, and it gets changed post 1917. And the reason it gets changed is because, as you can see here, it just isn't that functional to suggest that one person should be able to hijack an entire piece of legislation. So the quote that you see here from President Wilson, a little group of willful men representing no opinion but their own have rendered the great government of the United States helpless. And this is particularly having to do with the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I. His thought is that most of the Senate wants this treaty to be approved, but because a small group of senators don't, they're filibustering the heck out of it, and it's not going to get done. From that problem, the kind of the solution to that problem, I should say, is the idea of cloture. And cloture basically is that with a 2/3 vote in the Senate, filibusters can be stopped. So if you can get 67 senators to vote for a motion of cloture, you can end a filibuster. People can't continue to rant and rave on and on and on, filibustering for hours and hours or even days at a time if they want. At that point, from 1917 forward, when we introduced this idea of cloture, you can stop a filibuster. If you want to look at a filibuster, watch Rand Paul talk for almost 13 hours of debate. I'm not gonna watch this video as part of the lecture. If you want to know what filibustering looks like, this is only about a 3-minute video. It's pretty interesting. You can see some of the craziness that is involved in filibustering. Ted Cruz gets in on the action as well. He actually read tweets on the Senate floor in support of Rand Paul's filibuster. So yeah, they don't need to be like high-level debates as long as it is in some way, shape, or form related to whatever the bill is, or whatever the piece of legislation is, or whatever the topic is. As long as it is related a little bit, you can do it as part of a filibuster. Ted Cruz reading tweets on the Senate floor, a pretty good example of that. Filibusters can't be stopped unless 67 senators vote for cloture. 67 senators voting for cloture. I'm sorry, not 67, 60. 60 senators, I apologize. 60 senators voting for cloture. After a cloture vote, you still get 30 hours of debate. It's called a post-cloture debate. So if somebody's filibustering for 10, 12 hours, you finally get a cloture vote. 60 senators vote for cloture. There are still going to be 30 hours of debate before the bill is actually going to be voted on. The longest ever individual filibuster with one person standing and talking is 24 hours and 18 minutes. Senator Strom Thurmond from South Carolina in 1957 decided that he wanted to oppose a civil rights bill. He was a segregationist from the Old South, and he decided that he wanted to filibuster on a civil rights bill. So he filibustered by himself for 24 hours and 18 minutes before finally kind of running out of steam. But the filibuster before 1975, before we kind of changed the rules a little bit, you had to keep talking. It had to be constant. You could not stop or slow down, or no, you had to keep on going. You cannot sit down. You must stand at the podium the entire time you are filibustering, and you are allowed only water or milk. You are not allowed a snack. You are not allowed a sandwich. You are not allowed a cup of coffee. You get water or milk. You have to be standing, and you have to keep talking. And you get no restroom breaks. So when Strom Thurmond filibusters for 24 hours and 18 minutes in 1957, he does not go to the bathroom for 24 hours and 18 minutes, kind of. A lot of times what you'll end up seeing is that they end up putting buckets or other containers in the senatorial coat rooms, and a senator will leave the podium to go to the coat room and relieve themselves. Because the coat room is still considered part of the Senate chamber, as long as you are talking and standing the whole time, you are able to keep on filibustering. 60 votes to stop a cloture or to stop a filibuster to get a cloture motion ultimately is going to be problematic, and we kind of see the problematic nature of that come to fruition in 2013. You may or may not have heard of this idea of a nuclear option, right? And Democrats introduced the nuclear option in 2013 because 45 was the projected number. It actually ended up being a little bit less than that, but 45 of the nominees that President Obama had asked for the Senate to confirm, they were filibustered. So that video that I showed you earlier of Rand Paul and Ted Cruz, that was a debate about President Obama's nominee for the CIA, John Brennan. He wanted to nominate John Brennan to be the head of the CIA, and Republicans in the Senate filibustered on whether or not to vote, or filibustered instead of voting on whether or not to appoint Mr. Brennan to the head of the CIA. But you can see on the chart on the screen that the idea of filibustering executive nominees has rapidly grown in the last 2 decades. In President Obama's first term, Republicans filibustered on 27 executive nominees, and again, for his second term, the projection was 45. It ended up being a little bit less than that, but a lot of the people that he nominated for different jobs, Republicans in the Senate filibustered on. So Democrats changed the rules of filibustering. They changed the rules of filibustering, particularly changing the rules for how you get a cloture vote. Instead of requiring 60 votes To end a filibuster, they decide that they're going to change the rules to require only a majority. So 51 votes is now the number to end a filibuster. This is, again, frequently referred to as the nuclear option. The reason the Democrats did this is because they had 51 votes and they couldn't get 60, and they were tired of watching Republicans filibuster on executive nominees. The only place that rule change for cloture doesn't apply, the only time that the rule change doesn't apply, the nuclear option doesn't apply in 2013 is for Supreme Court justices. For the president to nominate a Supreme Court justice, if there is a filibuster over that nomination, it still takes 67 votes, or it still takes 60 votes to get a cloture motion on a Supreme Court justice. In 2018, Republicans decided that turnabout was fair play because they could not get to that 60 vote threshold to end a cloture motion, and they definitely couldn't get to a 67 vote approval, or a 67 vote approval number to confirm Justice Kavanaugh as the newest Supreme Court justice. So much the same way that Democrats used the cloture motion, or used the nuclear option to change how cloture votes work, in 2018, Republicans did the same thing, except it didn't have to do with cloture votes, it had to do with confirmation. So previously you needed 67 votes to approve a Supreme Court justice, and Republicans in 2018 changed the rules in the Senate, lowered the threshold, and said, no, actually, we're going to change the rules, and you only need a majority of votes to confirm a Supreme Court justice. The idea of filibustering is a controversial one, and typically it depends whether or not you're a member of the party in power. This comic does a pretty good job of illustrating that. When President Obama was a senator from Illinois, he was a big fan of the filibuster. When filibusters were being used against him as president of the United States, he was a much, much, much bigger critic of the idea of filibustering. And the same is true of Republicans, and has been throughout the course of American history. When your party benefits from filibusters, you tend to be a big fan. When your party doesn't benefit or gets hurt by filibustering, you tend to be very, very critical of them. But that debate over whether or not filibustering is a useful part of Senate procedure or not is really a big topic of conversation about whether or not this system is broken. I understand that the rule was put in place to allow for lengthy, rational, intelligent, healthy debate to take place in the Senate. But if we're being honest about it, really at this point, what filibustering does is it's used as a political tool. It's been used by both parties to kind of manipulate the rules. They've changed the rules a couple of different times, and this idea of a saucer, the Senate being a saucer in the place where rational and intelligent debate happens, is probably less true in 2020 than it was when Jefferson and Washington had their conversation back in the 1790s. All right, that is really about all I have for you today. We'll have some review stuff coming up over filibustering, probably posted on either Thursday. I think it'll be posted on Thursday. So you got that coming. Other than that, enjoy the rest of your day. I miss seeing you guys every day in class. I know that we're all kind of adjusting to this new normal, but I hope you are doing well, and I hope to see you soon.